All right, so Bruce, thank you for being with us. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and folks will join us as they do, or they'll join us asynchronously. Again, thank you so much for doing this, and yeah, I'll let you take it away because you've got the power of the processor. So put your stuff on the screen and let's get started, and we'll go from there.
Okay, let me get this. Okay. Now, thank you. I'm really looking forward to today in discussing the whole concept of the 5 missional shifts. And let me just share a little bit how it came about. And that was, we've done a lot of talking about the missional shift. This is, or the missional church. And this has been a conversation for 20 maybe plus years. And what I found was when I started to talk about the missional church, and you may have had this similar experience. I would be talking to a pastor or someone in a church, and they would ask me the question, what is the missional church? And I began to, what I would think was eloquently explain what it is. But what I was noticing was that their eyes were starting to glaze over, and their eyes were starting to turn back into their head. And I'm thinking, I don't think I'm communicating well. And I sometimes imagined what I was saying was blah, 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 blah. And I'm going, we're not communicating this well. So a group that I work with through the organization called Rewire, we began to have this discussion, and we said, I don't think we can describe a missional church, but we can talk about it in the terms of missional shifts, or a change of emphasis. And so what we came up with was the whole concept of what are the missional shifts. And I'll share with them in just a second, but they're a shift not necessarily away from, but a shift of emphasis. And that's what I want to share with you today. But in preparation of talking about that, what I'd like to share with you is, or just start out with talking about, excuse me, this isn't working. Let me stop sharing. Let me get this right here. Okay. Okay. Is really looking at what are the current realities that we're living into. Because we're in a time, and I'd say this has been wrestling around for a number of years, that we have some current realities that are, I would say, are shaking the church. And that is the whole concept of postmodernism has been much talked about, that somehow we're moving from the modernistic period to something else. And when you're in the midst of the shift, you really don't see clearly. I've noticed. We're also seeing, and this is all stuff you're, I'm sure, familiar with, an exiting from the church. And a lot of us thought that when this was occurring, people were leaving the faith, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Yeah. And then also another factor that we don't talk much about, but the exposure of the abusive church leadership. And maybe you've heard the podcast from the rise and fall of Mars Hill, and that kind of accentuates what seems to be what's being uncovered here. I had a professor at Wheaton, Walter Elwell was his name, and he said something in the 1980. And that was a time where the evangelical church was really coming into the forefront. And he said, you know, in the 50s and 60s, the liberals did not handle power, money, and sex very well. He goes, I'm wondering how the evangelicals will do it. This was in 1980. And today we're seeing that it hasn't gone well. And that's kind of caused some earthquake here. Also, especially with the death, the murder of George Floyd, accentuated what's been rumbling for years is the greater awareness of systemic racism. And that has really shaken the church. In fact, there's some fascinating writings as showing how where the evangelical church moved into this whole politicalism wasn't so much the abortion issue, but was more race issue. But it was termed in terms of abortion. That's a huge topic, and I'll just leave that there and for another day. And then most recently, the COVID this whole situation has rocked the church. And so those are some of the other realities. You might have some others. And let me just pause here and say, if you feel free to stop me at any time. We're going to have a time for question and answers, but feel free to stop me at any time. I'm open to stopping and having some dialogue or clarification as we go. But any other realities come to your minds?
You know, one of the things that I think of, Bruce, is that one of the current realities is that there's a lack of, at least in North America, a huge rise in a lack of church experience. That it's not just an exiting from the church, but also no longer an entry in the church, that people in their 20s, I don't think we're at the tipping point where the majority, but it's pretty darn close where nearly the majority have never set foot in a church for any reason whatsoever, not for a marriage, not for a funeral, certainly not for worship. And we're almost to a place where there is no understanding of any of the meta story anymore. There's no, Jesus who, and et cetera. So that's, I think, a current reality that the church is having to face, and that we can't just do a revival, expect people to show up and go, oh yes, of course I believe, because they have no foundation on which to build.
Mm-hmm. Great point. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, one more, and that's the rise of, again, in North America, well, the West actually, is the rise in persecution against Christianity and the church. Mm-hmm. That we're starting to, in other nations, of course, that's full blown going. Mm-hmm. But in the West, we're starting to see an increase, even though we have this quote freedom of religion, that we're seeing some oppression and persecution of the majority faith, which is barely a majority, but I guess a majority of other faiths, perhaps, but certainly not a majority in our world anymore, or our nation anymore.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just reflecting on a conversation I heard last night. I'm Jamaican, and this conversation was based on the age groups that are interested in church, that church attracts, and that is our reality in Jamaica. And also in Jamaica, we don't have a racism problem, but we have a social status problem. So the church, there are certain churches that are seen as elite churches. And so persons don't feel comfortable attending those churches.
Good point. Yeah. So in the current realities, we're saying the church, especially in the West, and I would hazard to guess, and I'm no expert, okay, in other cultures, I would guess that the Western church that has been exported into other communities may be facing some of the similar things. But the church is going through a change. And so we've come up with these 5 shifts. Let me just kind of share them with you quickly, and then I'm going to go through them. I could spend hours on each one of these. But first of all, we talk about a shift from a focus. And it's not saying a shift away from, but it's a shift of emphasis. And so it's a shift of emphasis away from church growth to kingdom impact. Is the first one. Second one is a shift away from information education to formation. The next shift is from making members or ministers to making missionaries. The fourth shift is a centralized mission to decentralized mission. And the last one is culturally relevant to culturally prophetic. So those are the 5 shifts that we talk about. And I'm sure there's others, but those are the 5 that we focus in on that I want to just kind of spend some time unpacking a bit today. And again, because of the time frame, I can't get deep into them, but I'm certainly willing to, especially during our time of discussion, unpack further. But feel free to break in as I'm talking about them if something hits you that you want to kind of dig into a little bit. But let me first go into the first one, the whole idea of church growth to kingdom impact. The emphasis has always been on how many came. The idea, if you build it, they will come. And the emphasis was always getting people to come to church and be a part of church. And so church growth was, especially the emphasis of it in the 70s and 80s, the whole church growth model was to get people to come to church. There was a study that was done in the early 2000s called the Reveal Study, and it was done by Willow Creek. I know they've been on hard times, and I know Bill Hybels has gone through some struggles, but even when people come through struggles, they still have been helpful to the kingdom. And one of the things he did was a study in the early 2000s, and it really what it revealed was they weren't making disciples like they thought they were. And I have a lot of respect for him, because I think if I was in his shoes, I'd have buried that study as deep as possible and not let anyone know that I wasn't as great as I thought I was. Okay. But instead, he published it. I got a lot of respect for someone who's going to publish something that doesn't tell them that what I'm doing is great. Okay. Because the chart on your left, I think it's on your left, it talks about the level of church activity. And the idea, the concept they basically said that is people are more involved in the church, that their spiritual attitudes of loving God and loving people will increase at the same proportion. And what they found out was that the level of activity in a church did not correspond to their spiritual behaviors of tithing and all of those kind of things, did not correspond to spiritual attitudes of loving God and loving people, growing deeper. Fascinating thing. And so they found out that their whole premise was not working. Now, we can look back and say, wow, you really blew it. But the thing that concerns me is this study has been around for over 12, 13 years. And we've known this study, this model doesn't work, yet we continue to perpetuate it. So my heart breaks more for we've continued, even though we know it doesn't work, we continue to perpetuate it. That just the whole concept of church growth, getting people into a building and being part of a service, is not necessarily going to change their spiritual attitudes. And so what we're saying is we have to make a shift to kingdom, to not our focus isn't to get people there, but to make a kingdom impact. And that is we have to really give, and this could be a huge discussion, but what is the gospel according to Jesus? And our claim would be, it is the announcement of the kingdom of God is at hand. It is the announcement that the kingdom of God, his reign and rule, is is today. Sometimes I like to say is Jesus came, and in his resurrection was the announcement that there's a new king in town, and his name is Jesus. And so the concept we're saying with the kingdom impact is moving people into the reign and rule of the kingdom, living out their life. And that would give a focus. And I know I'm going through quick, and you can pause me at any time. That really gives the focus to what, and that is, what is the kingdom? And this is what I would suggest. And this could be a lot of impact. But the rule and reign of Jesus is not just getting people to come to know Jesus. That is an important thing. I'm not diminishing it, okay? I'm not saying that's not what Jesus came for. I mean, that's not the only thing that he came for. It's for us to see people come to know Jesus and then wait to go to heaven, as N.T. Wright so eloquently talks about. But what is it? It's to establish his reign and rule. And I would claim it's seeking the peace, or the shalom. And so it would be the whole concept is the peace of God, the shalom of our community or our region. And how is that expressed? I would then go to the outside bubbles. It's expressed through seeking, focusing on justice, reconciliation, restoration, freedom. And by freedom, I would say salvation and freedom from the dominion of darkness. And that's where salvation would fit in. Inclusion, basically the concept of welcoming all are welcome, and jubilee. And I would say that includes economic justice and just the whole concept of jubilee. That's what I'd say is our focus of kingdom impact. This is the area of what we would say is, this is the kingdom impact. So I can pause. I'll pause just a moment. Any comments, questions? If not, I'll go into the next shift. And again, I'm more or less highlighting these shifts for you today. Any responses? Okay. Let me go into the next shift, and that would be a shift from education or information to formation. And the idea here, I think it's some of these are pretty self-explanatory, but the distinction is that in the discipleship of the church, often we find if a person knows and understands the Bible, that's going to bring change in their life. I recently heard a denominational leader say, if we can just get people to understand good theology, that will bring about good, basically the change in their way they live their life. And I'm saying, no, it won't. Information does not bring about change. I know some people who know the Bible backwards and forwards, and yet they do not have any love for the poor. Or I've never distinguished it from some folks in my conversations. There doesn't seem to be that change. And so information doesn't bring about formation. It can help. I'm not saying information is wrong or bad. It's helpful to know, to be educated, to gain education or knowledge and all. But as Paul says, knowledge alone puffs up. But the question isn't so much, what did I teach them this morning or in this lesson or whatever, but it's how has it brought formation into their lives? That becomes more the issue for us. What I often say, and this can drive church leaders crazy at times, is the church does not need any more Bible studies. And people will look at me in horror, like, but Bible studies in small groups are the death of a church, I think. Because what does it do? I think I may have been Francis Chan, someone who said this. This isn't original with me, although I'd love to. I wish I'd thought of it so I could claim it. But what we really do many times in teaching, just educationally, is we create people to be disobedient. And we create disobedience because if you know the truth and you don't do it, that's disobedience. And yet we teach every Sunday morning and people learn and they don't go out and often do it. I know I'm being very critical at this point, but that's what the tendency of what can happen. And so we see this moving from information just now to formation. And to unpack the whole concept of formation again is huge. But I'll what I mean by that and is really bringing back a discipleship that forms people in a deeper spirituality. And that is talking about the disciplines and prayer and the inward life. What I have discovered is that the discipleship nowadays, it emphasizes prayer as a transactional activity and not a relational activity. And so how do we guide and help people to move from and again, I'm using all this language that needs to be unpacked, but from being living in a false self sense. And the false self always asks the questions, what do I have? What do I do? And what do people think of me? That's how we tend to live our life. And we don't have a spirituality that helps move people to a place of not what do I have, what do I do, and what do people think of me, but a spirituality helping people move into their true self that asks the questions, what is God doing? What is God providing? And what is God saying to me? Jesus said this in two different times. He goes, I hear what the Father says and I say it. I see what the Father does and I do it. And it's how do we move people into that? And so the disciplines, and I always say the disciplines have no power. Okay, they have no power. But they put me in a place where I would call the sacred place, where I have a deep surrender to God. And again, I'll say this a number of times, but this has to be unpacked a whole lot. To which really puts me in a place for transformation to take place, which is obviously the work, what I would say is the Spirit. To move into the place of a me that God intended me to be. And so it's a movement of guiding people into that sacred space for transformation to take place.
Bruce, can you say more about what you mean by sacred space? Are you talking about Sunday morning worship, or what are we?
No, I would say the sacred place is the place for where God and I meet. And so it would be, I mean, one of the things we do in the order that I'm a part of is these are minimums, but we have a covenant of 30 minutes a day of prayer 5 days a week. I mean, Barna did a study, and I don't even know how he I find this hard that this was determined, but he said the average pastor prays 7 minutes a day. And I'm thinking, I don't know if I was surveyed, if I'd be honest about that. I think I would say, oh yeah, at least an hour, but I think that's it says something, and so it's saying it's discipline, it's discipling people into a deeper time of prayer, of surrendered prayer, and that's spending time in silence and solitude, listening, but developing people into that. So that the sacred place is for the time with me and God. And again, that could be hugely unpacked on that. This is more of introduction. Then the next one shift that we're talking about is a shift from making members to making missionaries, or sometimes we'll say making ministers. And this concept is often, many churches focus on equipping people to minister within the church structure. Because the church itself has developed programs for their members to not only participate in, but to help to pull off, to develop and to lead. And so it becomes a major focus of ministry involvement. Churches often work to get people involved in areas of their interests and talents, certainly, but the overriding need is to staff ministries and programs. And so the comments I just put in this slide were many churches, I just mentioned that, but they develop expectations and programs requiring members to participate in programs. Churches often work to get people involved in areas and interests and talents. I just kind of said those things, but that's the focus. And so what I'm talking about here, and even all of these shifts, begin to cause a trembling in church leadership. Because to talk about making every member a missionary begins to work against people staffing the nursery, being a part of the children's program, helping out with the youth group, what major events that are taking place. Because if people are living on mission, it's not going to necessarily translate into people working into the main programs of the church. So what I'm talking about here is it can be a very difficult thing. It sounds great. I mean, making every member to making everyone a missionary, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But the implications of it certainly could. And so the change we're talking about here would be, the questions that often for members is, how do we get people involved? Whereas for missionaries, it's how do we connect and help people to live out their call or their passion? That's a hugely different question. So it's a shift of not how do we get people involved and equip them for that, but how do we connect them really to their sense of call and their mission? If we believe that we're created in the image of God and God has knit us together and knit deep desires in us, this goes back to really the whole concept of formation, is understanding how I've been formed and what God formed in me. And if that's what we're helping people to understand, that's a different way of discipleship than getting people involved. And so we in this is a shift to, we have a sending God that sends us out. And so really in this shift, we begin to have a focus on our call. And so empowering people to discover and live out their call becomes an important part of this. And we would say there's three types of callings. First of all, there's the first two are general for everybody, and that is the call to God, the call to follow. As Jesus said, "Follow me." And I often says Jesus has two commands and two calls. And the two commands are to love or the two calls are to follow me and to go. And the two commands obviously are to love God and to love our neighbor. And so the two calls here would be, first of all, to God, follow, to love God with all our heart, our mind, our soul. And so that would be the part of surrendering our life to God. So that's a common call for all of us. Next term is common, so I shouldn't use common call. That's a call to all. There's also what I would say is a common call, and that is we're all called to love our neighbor. We're all called to care for the poor, I would say. I mean, I have a bias, and I believe it's true. Deeper union with God always leads us to the poor. Now, I know that right there, we could spend the rest of our time just discussing that. But we have a common call to love our neighbor, to give, to those common calls. And then finally, we also have a call, what we would say is a life thread or a missional call. And this is the unique way a person is created by God, and a unique way that they live out their call. And that's the thing we would say is, in making missionaries, we have to ignite, we have to give focus and a discipleship that ignites people. One of the things we see that is the intersection where our deep gladness and the world's meets with the deep hunger, the world's deep hunger. Okay, connect. Or another way of looking at this is our deepest wounds connect us to the wounds of the world. Perfect example of that would be, you might not be able to notice on video, but I only have one ear. I was born without an ear. Therefore, it created a difference. Most people have two ears, okay? And so when you're different, people don't like that, or I don't know if they don't like it or what, but they certainly ridicule it. And being bullied while I was growing up created some very deep wounds in my soul. And so what happened is, why most of my life I've lived among those on the margins or in the poor, because my deep wounds connects me with the woundedness of being on the margins. That's part of my life call. It wasn't necessarily how it was designed, but it sure was how it was formed on that. And so it's developing a discipleship and moving people from making members to making missionaries. I'll pause. Any comments on that? Okay, let me move on then to the next one. And this one is huge. All of them are, I think. But we're talking about moving from a focus of centralized mission to decentralized mission. And as we look at this shift, why I say it's so huge is it rattles centralized leadership. Remember that when we talk about these shifts, and this is where this comes in, change does not often happen, or very rarely happens, from the core of the church or the core of leadership. We believe in the that change happens on the margins. Change usually begins to occur on the margins. Why? Because they don't have as much vested or invested in the leadership. I mean, I'll hear an example is I'll hear denominational leaders say, "We're going to change," and I'm going, I know in your heart you want to, but if you begin to make these changes, you're going to lose funding, thus you lose your salary. and you lose your livelihood, and that's what's at stake. I did we were doing these missional leader cohorts where we were taking people through these shifts and taking them through how to live this out and how to live it out personally, and then also as a leader. Of the first cohort I took through this of 12 people, 2 dropped out, and no, I'm sorry, 5 ended up dropping out. Okay, so we had 7, and of those 7, 4 ended up either being removed or leaving their church when they started doing some of these. So I often said, I don't think people want to be around me, because if you do, you may end up losing, if you're a pastor, losing your being removed or leaving your church. Centralized power can be threatened by some of these things. Not that they're against it, but it threatens the way they do things. And so the shift, so to decentralize requires empowering people to take on responsibility and authority to set direction and practices. The shift of empowering people, by definition, is a power shift. And so we're talking about, from moving to decentralization, is we're talking about empowering people. And so an example would be if a group of people said, and this happened in a church I was working with, they really had a heart. There was a group of people who really had a heart for women who were coming out of prison. And it was a church that was in more of a rural area, and that's where they put prisons to create jobs. So we set them up as what we would call a missional group. And so and empowering them to you do it. And so after they got started, they were needing funding. And so they came and said, hey, we need the church to give us a certain amount of money. I said, no, we're trying to decentralize. And so you have to think through your funding plan. We'll help you think through it. We might even give you some seed monies, but to decentralize is to decentralize. We want to empower you you have to figure out how you'll be self-sustaining as this group. And we want to empower you. Now this again takes on a whole level of how do you train, equip people to live out as a missional group. But it's a shift to empower people to take on that ministry. But as we're doing it, we have to guide people into the questions: what is God doing, and how do I join him? What is my life thread calling me to, and how am I formed, designed, or gifted, and created, and what I'm created for? And so the result is the merging of these questions for a person of living on mission. This adjusts to the discipleship pathway that I was talking about, moving people from every person a member to every person a missionary. And so we have it happens on a discipleship level of how do we form people, how do we guide people in their own personal formation to live on mission, and then creating a place that they can carry this out in a communal form with others with a common call. Does that make sense? Now, so there's the personal level, but then there's also this touches on what I'd call the structural level. How might it look in your church? And so what we'd have to do, and again, this is a one that is hugely unpacked, but it would be how do we, what does the church centralize and what does it decentralize? And what I mean by that is the decentralization is giving up power to the missional groups or groups that would be formed. That those groups being formed are not told by centralized mission what you're doing. You're moving from the church leadership saying, we as a church are going to start a food pantry, let's say. We were talking about that earlier, Bill, a food pantry. And so, okay, we need to find people to do this. And so it goes through a whole recruiting stage. But it's saying, no, the church doesn't do that, but the church is discipling people to begin to identify what's God calling them to do or to be. Now, and so what gets centralized? Perhaps what's centralized is we have a common worship time, maybe once a week, maybe once a month. There's a example of this, and you may have heard of the underground church, Tampa Underground Church. And they have basically decentralized, and they have missional groups. They used to have a common worship service every week, and 30% of their groups would come. It could be different groups every week, but about 30%. Now they've come to a common worship time once a month as a whole gathering, but their missional groups meet weekly, and then and all. And so it's moving away from a structure that looks something like this: a top-down hierarchy, a clear chain of command, clear communication, and standardized policies and procedures. And so it's moving from something like this to something like this, which I can't even explain. But basically, it's a broad power distribution. And you're beginning to give groups autonomy. Begin to be organic and adaptable, and really emphasize on smallness. And there's another example of the Tampa Underground is a good example. Another example is Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C. They've been around since the 1940s. They might be the first modern day, what we would call missional church, before we got the fancy language and wrote all the books. But how they formed were people began to, they emphasized the inward, the outward, and the together journey. The inward journey is deeper union with God. The together journey is living in an authentic group that you're called together because of a common mission. And the outward is living that mission together. And each of these groups had to be self-sustaining, self-supporting. And if you'd go there today, I mean, it is incredible what they've grown into as far as their various groups. Now, their church, the church itself is still 150 members, 150 people. And the pastor, or one of the leaders said, yeah, we got up to be 150 and we felt like we're getting too big. And I had to laugh, and I said, I don't know any pastor in the US that would say 150 is being too big. But they felt that their missional groups could only, once they got over 2025, it began to lose its the strong involvement of the people part of that group. So those little dots were usually 25 or less people that were living on mission together. But that would be moving to a decentralized. I'll pause there. I said a whole lot more than I intended to just to confuse you. Okay. Then I have one last missional shift, and that's moving from being culturally relevant to culturally prophetic. And again, as in different times, there's different emphasis. And the church growth movement in the 80s was really a focus on the church becoming relevant. And that was a needed message for that day. I'm not looking back in history and judging. I'm saying that was a needed message, because it was saying, understand and begin to teach and to reach out in ways that are relevant to people, and to understand that felt need. And that's still important today, and to walk with people in that felt need. But what we would say is, what's I find is the church is enculturated. That what well, another way of saying that is there's a cultural captivity that's taken place. That I find, what are those cultural avenues of captivity? Well, it can be on many things, but one of them would be materialism and consumerism. Another one can be safety and security. Another one can be a technology, like we're right on. Another one can be, let's see, what are some other ones? Comfort, pleasure. Those are all cultural addictions that I have said has enculturated the church. And part of discipleship, I would say, in a new era, has to be addressing our cultural captivity. In fact, one of the things we encourage in discipleship is taking people through, and we designed this one course. It's called Cultural Captivity. But we have people identify their cultural addiction, take them through the 12 steps to break their addiction, for freedom. Often I find that the number one is materialism and consumerism. And so what we would say is, in the whole concept of moving from culturally relevant to culturally prophetic, is one of the first things is we've got to break our cultural addictions. I mean, especially after 9/11, safety and security went on steroids. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be safe and secure, but if I really look at the teachings of Jesus and the life of Jesus, his number one value was not safety and security. I mean, personally, when I moved into the inner city, I had so many people come to me. I moved into the inner city when my kids were 1, 3, and 5. And I'll never forget, I had an elder in my church come to me, and he pointed his finger, and I think he had the biggest fingers in the world. At least when it was pointed right at me, it seemed like a big finger. And he said, "You are going to ruin your children." And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, if I just made the dumbest move in my life. And I mean, we lived right in the midst of, and I'm not saying everyone should do this, but this was a call that we clearly had in sense from God. We moved into a community that had gang violence, and we were in the midst of it all. In fact, I often laugh because down our street were kids who would deal drugs, and I knew them all because they were my former Little League players. And I would go down there and walk my dog there, and they'd call me Coach Bruce, and we would have conversations. And then I found out, because I became a friend of a guy who was the head drug dealer in the community there, that years later he shared with me that he'd put a hit on my life, and hit out on me, because I was going down there talking to the kids, and there's no way people are going to come and buy drugs when a older white guy is standing on the corner. Now, just to tell the story, the guy, the head drug dealer, and I got to know each other very, very about a week after he put a hit out on me, and he took it off. And in all of that, he started to follow God, follow Jesus, which was a phenomenal thing. And I was glad he took the hit off on me. That wasn't I just say that to say it wasn't a safe, secure place, but that's not what we're called to, is safe and secure. So the whole concept of breaking our cultural addiction is important, because to be prophetic. Dr. King made this statement in regards to the prophetic church. And he said, the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state. And in our current reality, I'm afraid, I'm not trying to get political. I am going to get political, but it is evident that statement is not understood today by the church, but rather the conscience of the church, of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. And I mean, those words were spoken many years ago, but they're so true for us today, that we're called to speak out the values of the kingdom. And that would go back to the slide I shared earlier about those values of shalom and justice and all community. But we're called to have a prophetic voice, and that would be, we're called to what? A sign, a foretaste, the first fruits, an agent of the reign of God that Jesus announced and inaugurated. That whole the kingdom of God is now, but not yet. And we are called to not be speaking, not to give a focus to cultural relevance, but being culturally prophetic, to speak into the culture. And that is not so much of the values that right now the church is hung up on, but to speak on the values that Jesus spoke to, and that would be the values of justice and reconciliation, restoration, freedom from sin, and living in freedom, inclusion, all are welcome, jubilee, having a speaking into that. And so those are the five missional shifts that we emphasize. And again, as I mentioned many times here, I've only touched the surface on those shifts. To begin to really make them alive, we've got to dig deeper into those shifts. But they also, what I think is important about these shifts is that it doesn't say to a group of, to a church or to a group of churches or to a group of people, this is how you specifically live it out. That's not defined in the missional shifts. The shifts are just saying this is a change of emphasis that you have to bring to your community and the expression of the church to your community, of what you live out. This is what these are the things you have to consider. Now you have to think through how that is incarnated. And so when we talk about the missional church, it's not something easily defined in a very specific term, because we can't, quite frankly, we can't talk about it specifically. We can only talk about the framework of a missional church, and that's what I believe this helps to bring to a group of people on that. So let me just kind of pause on that, and any comments, reactions, or discussion points you would like to make. And maybe it'd be not good for me to go back to the previous slide that lists all of the shifts, so you can just have them in memory. And these are the shifts that we talked about. But yeah, any comments, discussions that you would like to have in regards to this?
Well, the shifts that you have mentioned, that your research and what you have presented is based basically on the US, but as I said, I am from Jamaica and they seem very relevant. And so I am thinking, my question to you is, it seems difficult within context for leaders to even see the need to change. So how can you get this mindset change? Because I think that is where we would need to start.
Yeah.
To have a wake-up call.
I think you have really touched it, and I mean, a couple things I'd comment on what you said. And number one, this has got more of a Western view to it because that's the context I live in. And so I've continually have talked to some folks on our team who are from other contexts, and some of them fit well, some don't. And so we always have to ask: is this fit into our context? But what you're saying is also was how do you move people, especially leaders? Because number one, leaders have a lot invested in the form that they exist in, and a lot of times they've been trained in those forms, and so it's number one, they don't see a difference. I mean, just let me speak about just normal folks in the pews or in the church. I find after they've gone through this a whole a year and a half discipleship process, we feel we've discovered that it takes 18 months to move a person from into a missional church expression. And even people after 18 months, I find when they go through stress or difficulties, many times they go back to the old church expression because that's their default. So number one, we have these defaults deep in us that are so rooted that are hard to break.
Yes.
So, but what do we do? Well, I believe there's three ways to help that people are motivated to change: love, angst, and anger. Okay. I think those are three. We find the most effective is angst. When a person lives in angst, that will motivate them. And I suppose if I'm a good Christian, I should say love, okay? But I find interestingly, and I think that's what Jesus used, because he would make these statements: sell all your possessions and give it to the poor. And then he would let that person sit with it. I kind of imagine some people would say, oh, okay, come on back. As he's walking, the disciples or the person's walking away, the rich young ruler's walking away. Come back. Just sell half your possessions and give it to the poor. Okay, well, just give something to someone and then come follow me. But Jesus didn't do that. He said, okay, well, just sit in that. I'll let you sit in that. And so part of what we're not trained to do is to let people sit in their angst. Like one of the teaching techniques or within our pedagogy is letting people sit in their angst. So they'll ask a question and we'll say, yeah, it's a good question. Why don't you sit with that this week? People are expecting us to answer questions. So one of the things is is helping is when leaders begin to feel some angst, letting them sit in that. Now, we don't necessarily create angst, or we can tell them, like when I started out and talking about kingdom impact, I showed the slide, the reveal study, and the reveal study shows that what the form of church that we've been doing doesn't work, and yet we've continued that. And a lot of pastors know deep down in their heart what they're doing isn't working. It's not transforming people. Because the question we ask is, how many people are coming? How many people have been deeply impacted? I mean, one of the statistics I would show is the statistics suggest that only 25% are impacted by sermons. Yet we spend 80% of our time focused on sermon preparation usually.
It seems more church attendance and involvement in church seems just like another way of passing your time, and just a tradition for many people. But to see the ripple effect in terms of a difference in how we deal with life as church members as against those who are not, that is an issue.
Yeah.
And so the impact of the church is questioned.
Yeah. I mean, the question is, how have you seen people change, being transformed? Deep transformation. And what kind of impact do you see people making into the world? And so those are the questions, not how many people came to church. We talk about the 3 B's: the budget, butts in the pew, and buildings. Those aren't the questions anymore. What is the impact you're having for the kingdom? And so maybe those kind of discussions would help to raise the angst of leaders.
They're interested to make the change.
Yeah.
But as you point out, leaders they love and our church members for that matter, we like the idea of change, but that's kind of where it ends. Is we kind of like the idea, but don't ask me to change, because as you said earlier, it impacts my salary, or impacts how I do my job, or impacts my prestige, or the power that I have for within my congregation, or lack thereof.
Yeah.